Welcome, everyone. I'm Lori Marino, and I'm the Executive Director of the Camilla Center for Animal Advocacy and President of the Whale Sanctuary Project. I want to welcome everyone to this joint webinar, the Camilla Center and Whale Sanctuary Project webinar on scholar advocacy in marine mammal science. This is the second in a series of live webinars the Camilla Center is offering on scholar advocacy in different disciplines. Our first one was on scholar advocacy in neuroscience, and you can find that on the Camilla website and Facebook page. And as you know, the Whale Sanctuary Project offers a live series of webinars, discussions, presentations, and you can find out more about those on the Whale Sanctuary Project webpage calendar of events. Now, this online webinar was scheduled to be part of this year's SuperPod 7 meeting on Friday Harbor, Washington, and obviously circumstances being what they are, that had to be canceled. But because of that cancellation, we're offering this online, and we hope that we'll be back live in person next year. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome 5 scholar advocates, friends, and colleagues who are in the marine mammal sciences. They're going to talk about their experiences and answer your questions. So I'm just going to introduce each very briefly and then ask each one to say just something very brief about who they are and what they do, and then we're going to get right into things. So I'm first joined by Dr. Deborah Giles, and Giles, you could wave. Your Science and Research Director, Wild Orca. Mariah Carey. Mariah is a biology educator and a participant of, you can unmute yourself, Mariah.
Thank you so much for calling me Mariah Carey.
Oh, did I say it again? Mariah Carey, I can't believe it. Mariah Kirby.
That's fine.
Okay, Mariah Kirby, everyone. And Mariah is an alumnus of the first webinar, well, the first in-person scholar advocacy session held in Friday Harbor. Dr. Naomi Rose. Naomi is a marine mammal scientist with the Animal Welfare Institute. And Kara Elizabeth Henderlight, who is the advocacy chair for the American Citation Society. So I think what we'll do is, I'm going to just say a little bit more, and then we'll get into our first question. And as you answer your first question, you could talk a little bit more about yourselves. And you'll see that the first question is really all about just, you know, who you are, why you're here, why you do what you do. But before we get into the webinar, I just want to take a few minutes to define scholar advocacy. Scholar advocacy is a professional term, right? And it really means blending scholarship in various forms, science, education, art, in whatever forms, and advocacy for a constituency or societal change, an environment, cancer patients, and in our case, animals. So while most of you in the sciences especially have been taught that you cannot be an animal advocate and study animals at the same time, this is false. Scholar advocacy, basing one's advocacy on scientific data and scholarship, is really a very powerful and effective way to create change. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't be an advocate and a scientist who studies animals. So whether you are someone who studies animals or you're an advocate for animals, science and advocacy go together. And that is at the heart of what we are talking about today. So today we're going to start off with a question for the panelists and then shift to audience questions. And The audience can send questions to the Q&A, and I am just going to make sure it's at the Q&A. So you have a Q&A button there. You can send in your questions and we will get to as many as possible. And then we'll go back to a final question. So everyone ready? Mariah Carey, are you ready? Mariah Kirby, Naomi Rose, Kara, and Giles. Great. So here's our first question, and it's for the panelists. How would you describe the role scholar advocacy has had in your life? And why do you think it is important for you to be both a marine mammal scientist or educator or scholar and an advocate for marine mammals? So that kicks us off. So Giles, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. And Lori, thanks so much for the invite to participate in this. It's really sad not to be able to see you guys in person for sure, but we're crossing our fingers for next year. So I have two hats that I wear. I'm the science and research director for a nonprofit called Wild Orca. And what I say I do there is translational science is the best way to describe that. My other hat that I wear is I'm a research biologist with the University of Washington Center for Conservation Biology. And in that role, I am a participant in a project that's been going on since 2007, where we utilize a scat detection dog on the front of our boat to sniff out killer whale feces, and now baleen whale feces as well. And that work is done through the Center for Conservation Biology under the PI leadership of Sam Wasser. And our work there is to collect the raw data and answer questions related to the any sort of threat that might be occurring to this population of killer whales, mostly. And then again, as I said, we've expanded to mammal-eating killer whales in the region and also baleen whales. So the name of that group that I'm associated with at the university is conservation biology. And one of the tenets, in case people don't know, that conservation biology was coined in 1985 by a professor named Michael Soule. And the whole discipline of conservation biology is a crisis-oriented discipline. And by definition, it is trying to conserve biology. And so one of the main tenets of conservation biology is that there are many of them, 10 that I try and live every day. But one of the main ones is that as a researcher, it is incumbent upon us, the onus is on us as researchers to put our science in the hands of policymakers. It's not okay just to do science for science sake when you're studying an endangered species. And so I'm very fortunate to get to work for the Center for Conservation Biology, be able to have that security in knowing that every time I do science advocacy, every time I do advocacy for the whales and for ecosystems that the whales rely on, I am fulfilling my job as a conservation biologist. But I do get pushback from people that say I'm too connected, too emotionally connected to my main top subjects, the Southern residents. But we can get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, we are. We're going to get it. We'll get into that. That's important. That's kind of where things sort of converge, and that's what scholar advocacy is all about. So thank you. Naomi?
Yeah, I'm with the Animal Welfare Institute, as Lori mentioned. I'm their marine mammal scientist, and I've been doing scholar advocacy, although I did not necessarily call it that when I first started, since 1993. So I initially thought I would be an academic. I studied orcas, just like Giles did, out there, up in British Columbia, though, the northern residents. And I thought I'd be a biology professor or something like that. It just turned out that, and I learned this as a teaching assistant, that I didn't really have the patience for it. Dealing with students one-on-one was a bit tough for me, and I wasn't I wasn't patient enough to handle, the learning process. So I decided I would try to work for a nonprofit organization for a little while. And I literally thought it would be for a little while. And then I would try something else, and that was back in 1993. So when I started with a nonprofit group, it was an animal protection organization. I immediately started working on welfare issues primarily, but also just sort of in the wild protection issues, conservation issues, environmental protection issues as a scientist, because I was one of the few PhDs who was working on animal welfare at the time, particularly marine mammal welfare in captivity. In fact, to my knowledge, I was actually one of the first PhDs to work professionally as an advocate on captive marine mammals. And then within a couple of years, there were a couple of us, but there's still only a few of us, Lori being one of them, Giles being another, but there's very few PhDs who've, sort of really worked on the welfare of captive marine mammal issue. There's a lot more degree holders who are out there advocating for marine mammals in the wild. Noise, impacts, pollution, whaling, and all of that. And that community is large, but there's still a stigma attached to being too much of an advocate. And as Giles pointed out, that you shouldn't be so emotionally attached to your animals. There's still a stigma to that. But when you're actually dealing with captive marine mammals, it's 10 times worse. And it is remarkable how many of my former colleagues have, and I call them those folks former colleagues because they've actually ostracized me for my advocacy. And then others who have joined me and have become more comfortable talking about these quote unquote emotional things. So it's been an interesting journey over the last 27 years, dealing with the public and professional attitudes toward me as a scholar advocate and the issues that I focus on. So it is my life, what I'm doing. It turned out I was only going to be here for a couple of years, and I'm here for life. So it turns out that I'm actually really well suited to trying to persuade people to see things as I see them, because that's what I think it is. That's what scholar advocacy is. That's what advocacy is you're trying to persuade people to see things, whatever they may be, human rights, animal rights, environmental protection, as you said, cancer advocacy, anything that you decide that you're going to advocate for, your goal is to persuade people to see that issue the way you see it, because you believe in your heart of hearts that what you want to accomplish in that field is where the field needs to go, is where society needs to go. And so if you're good at being persuasive, good at basically being an advocate, because that's what it means, is you're trying to persuade people, then it's for you. And if you can bring science and logic and facts to it, then I think it's all the more powerful.
Thank you, Naomi. Thanks very much. Kara?
Hi. So my path to scholar advocacy was not traditional, I guess, by any means. I've never lived by the ocean. I still don't. I'm from Tennessee. I live in Wisconsin. But it definitely guided me and brought me to kind of where I am today. I knew early on that I wanted to educate people and kind of share my passion for citations to try and evoke a sense of empathy, but also action from them, much like I felt with it myself. I also knew pretty early on that I did not want to conduct research, but rather utilize it to influence change and policy and stuff like that. So looking back at my collegiate career, I might have been a scholar advocate before I even knew that there was such a thing or before that sort of thing existed. So during my undergrad, I majored in environmental science, and I went to a private liberal arts school in Wisconsin, quite far from the ocean, as you can imagine. But every course that I took, and I do meet in every course, I try to introduce orcas into papers and projects and presentations, really anything that I could, try to like tie them into. I was successful in my GIS course, and I created a map of optimal sea pin locations for Lolita off the coast of Washington, and trying to explain who she is and what the purpose was to a group of Midwesterners was quite difficult and challenging, honestly, because they didn't quite get it. I was not so successful in my soils and hydrology course, where my professor very quickly shut down my attempt at integrating cetaceans into that project. I was going to talk about some large-scale biomagnification, but he just kind of couldn't really see the picture like I could. So after my undergrad, I knew I wanted to continue pursuing working with cetaceans. So I had the opportunity to assist with fieldwork with two researchers in British Columbia who were studying northern resident orcas, fin whales, and humpback whales. And that experience actually further solidified my passion for advocating for captive cetaceans. After seeing them in the wild at kind of their natural habitat, I just couldn't idly sit by, and I used my education and experiences and passion to really speak on their behalf. So that kind of brings me to my current role. I knew it would be beneficial to have a higher degree with more conservation and practical skills, so to work with a variety of stakeholders and such. So I attended grad school at Uw-Madison, Nelson's Institute for Environmental Studies, and I got a professional master's degree in environmental conservation. During this time is when I formed the American Cetacean Society Student Coalition, Uw-Madison chapter. So I kind of utilized that to educate my classmates and community that land seed stewardship is important, as well as issues surrounding captive cetaceans. To do that, I organized a panel discussion on captivity that both Dr. Marino and Dr. Rose came. And towards the end of my program, I actually completed my required professional placement at the Sea Life Trust Beluga Whale Sanctuary in Iceland to help them prepare for the arrival of little white and little gray, as well as care for the puffins and aquarium animals. And during that time, I was also asked to join the American Cetacean Society in a leadership role as their advocacy chair, which is what I hold today. So as you can see, advocacy kind of with a foundation of passion, but built upon with education and experiences, kind of guided my life and to where I'm currently. And as I am now an early, I guess I would say very early into a career of scholar advocacy, I think this combination kind of proved invaluable. And I think for myself, why I think it is important to be both a scholar and an advocate, it's as simple as if not to advocate for those animals that the research is being conducted on, and for, like, why conduct it at all, so thanks.
Thank you, Kara. Thanks so much for that. And Mariah.
Hi everyone, I'm Mariah. I'm currently a high school biology teacher in St. Louis, Missouri, and my path was also not a traditional one. It started when I actually saw the documentary Blackfish, and when that happened, it didn't start my passion for marine mammals, but it changed my passion for marine mammals. And I just started doing more research into it, and I did find, the science, behind why they shouldn't be in captivity, why they don't do well, and then that led me to their wild counterparts that also aren't doing well everywhere in the world. So when I was a freshman in college, I had a oral communications class, and it was a persuasive speech we had to give, and I gave mine on why you should not go to SeaWorld. And I recorded it and I sent it out to everyone's contact information that I could find that was in the Blackfish documentary, and got kind of connected with everyone there. And ever since then, I've been more and more involved. And what I do currently really is in my biology classroom, which I am certified to teach biology 9 through 12 and all levels of biology as well. We are transitioning to a new type of science curriculum in the classroom that's based on phenomena, like one anchoring phenomena or one anchoring situation or group of organisms or something, and then it follows a storyline based off that phenomena. So students are more so learning by discovery instead of learning by, you know, me just spewing information at them. And I get to intertwine my advocacy and my knowledge for marine mammals into my curriculum in my public high school. I've also self-published a children's book available on Amazon, and any revenue that comes from that is then donated to the Whale Sanctuary Project. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. As you can see, we all come from slightly different places, but we actually are all scholar advocates in our own way. And that's the point, is not that you have to fit into a particular mold, but that you are someone who is a scholar and an advocate for animals at the same time in your particular way. For myself, I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I didn't get into this business by being interested in marine biology or whales or anything like that. I was just interested in how the brain works in other animals. And that led me to study dolphins, and I saw a dolphin brain in a book one day, and I became hooked and started studying that and continue to study that for the past 30 years. And in the process of studying dolphins, coming from that point of view, I learned a lot about what dolphins and whales go through in captive situations. And I made the decision mid-career to stop doing research with dolphins and whales who are kept in concrete tanks, and to advocate for them, to use my scientific training to advocate for them. So that's my story, and we're all here to let you know that you can be a scientist and an advocate, or an educator and an advocate at the same time. We're going to start with our Q&A session, but let me remind you that, you know, we've got a number of questions queuing up here. Go to the Q&A and post a question, and we're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. So we're going to start off with one by Robert, who says, and it's very interesting, Jane Goodall talked about her scientific observations being dismissed because of her description of chimp relationships and emotion. I am fascinated, Robert says, by these ideas in whales and dolphins. I am a human psychiatrist. And how can we advocate for the emotional and social needs of large-brained whales and dolphins most effectively using science and conservation training? Great start-off question. Who would like to start off the panel and discuss that? Naomi?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem here. You know, the whole point is, one of the paradigm shifts that I think folks like Lori and perhaps Giles and the others, and certainly myself, are working toward is getting people to understand that all animals have emotional and social needs. They all have a mind. They all have a consciousness and emotional needs, and you know, they can suffer, you know, and some, you know, suffer more, you know, immediately, sort of basically because their cognitive functions are relatively, you know, less complex. And then others, you know, have cognitive abilities that are very complex, and their suffering, you know, is more nuanced, perhaps, you know, is a way of putting it. You know, even when they look healthy and seem healthy, they might actually be having sort of inner turmoils that are remarkably similar, I think, at times to humans. And it isn't a sin. This is sort of an answer to your question, Robert. It isn't a sin to anthropomorphize, because quite frankly, what else do we have to compare the animal world to except ourselves as a different animal? You know, it is inappropriate to assume that every animal will respond the same way we do. In fact, I make a real point of not assuming that, because the way I put it is, you know, we're really crappy orcas. We're not very good at it. We're not very good at being orcas, and we don't really understand, you know, exactly what they go through and what they think and all of that. And quite frankly, they're really terrible human beings, but they're better at it than we are, because in captivity, they know what we want them to do, but we don't know what they want from us necessarily. Well, they want food and they want attention, but we don't know, you know, exactly what they need, and we can't give it to them. So they're better at communicating with us than we are at communicating with them, or perhaps it's better to say it the other way around. So the point being that we should assume that most animals have an inner life. In fact, all animals have an inner life. And we need to be aware of that and do our very best to understand it, which may be very limited, but we need to try. And the very thing we shouldn't do is assume they don't have an inner life, which is how society has sort of treated animals over the generations. We just have assumed that they're black boxes with, you know, as long as we give them enough to eat and enough to drink and, you know, enough exercise, we've satisfied all their needs, which is clearly not true. And we know that now. We know it's not true. And it's actually something that we have to keep working on, shifting that paradigm. Most people still think that, you know, as they put it, animals don't have a soul. And I'm not religious, so I don't know whether they do or they don't, but they definitely have inner lives. And we need to open up people's perspective, the general public's perspective, to the fact that that is the truth. And so that's what we're all doing. Again, to get more specifically in response to your question, Robert, that's what we're all doing. We're just trying to get people to understand that animals do have inner lives. They are beings. They have individual personalities and so on, and we need to address those. And one size does not fit all in terms of care and maintenance in captivity or in how we handle them out in the wild. Every individual, as well as every species, has value. You know, if we don't treat them that way, then we're harming our own, you know, characters and our own ideals and our own souls. So, you know, we need to, you know, I think it was Gandhi who said, you know, a society is judged by the way it treats its animals, and it really is.
Thank you. Thanks, Naomi. Giles?
Everything that Naomi just said is spot on. I think the other thing that we can do, you know, your question specifically, how can we advocate for the emotional and social needs of large-brained whales and dolphins most effectively using science and conservation training? Two things pop into mind is looking at animals in their own lives and being good observers to what's happening for them. Of course, we had the tragic events of 2018 with one of our wild killer whales, J35, Telequat, who gave birth to a full-term female calf who lived less than 30 minutes, probably considerably less than 30 minutes. And J35 carried her baby around for 17 days, first on the top of her head as long as she could do that. And then as the body started to come apart, she carried that calf around in her mouth. And that is not the behavior of something that doesn't have an emotional inner life. That's the behavior of a being that is suffering. And I think to that end, looking at Dr. Moreno's work gives us the best opportunity to really understand why that might be. You know, killer whale brains are highly, highly, highly evolved. They've got parts of their brains that we either lack or ours are considerably smaller and underdeveloped. And these are areas of the brain that are associated with emotion and memory. And so I look at killer whales as being better versions of us. Like we should aspire to be as good as them. And we're failing miserably.
And so I think, you use the physiology of an animal, you use the behavior of an animal and their interactions in their own life. Animals are highly evolved and attuned to live the best life they can within their natural environment. And those animals that are trying to make a living in the world that we're creating for them, honestly, I'm surprised we've got any animals at this point, because we actively seek to damage the natural world in every way possible. But specifically to your question, I think look at the science, look at the physiology of the animal and the behavior of the animal, living its best life in its most optimal habitat, and they'll tell you how to advocate for them. It's as clear as day.
Thank you very much. Kara or Mariah, do you want to weigh in on that?
I was going to say something. I gave a presentation in my land use policy and planning course about the lower Snake River dams and their removal and its impact on the southern residents and stuff. And through the whole presentation, the classmates were paying attention and listening, of course. But then I put up a picture of J35 carrying her deceased calf. I was crying in front of my classmates and professors, and I think that image probably spoke to them more than my entire presentation. Not of me crying, that was embarrassing, but just seeing that they're emotional, intelligent beings, I think probably solidified to them how important, conserving them is. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Kara. I would like to just say something about anthropomorphism, because that really is, I think what is at the heart of the question about how Jane Goodall named the chimpanzees, and Naomi, you talked about this. It isn't anthropomorphism if the other animal has that same trait. Anthropomorphism is attributing a uniquely human characteristic to a member of another species. If we share that characteristic with the other species, it's not anthropomorphism. And everything we're learning, and this is happening on a day-to-day basis, we're learning about the brain, we're learning about cognition. Across the animal kingdom, we're finding more and more shared features. So there is less and less to anthropomorphize about, in a sense, right? And so don't be, the word anthropomorphism is a word that is sometimes weaponized to say, oh, you're being too emotional, or you think they're little people, or this. But no, it's absolutely the case that it is only when you attribute uniquely human characteristics to animals who don't have those characteristics that it is anthropomorphism, and that's probably not a good thing. So that's something to keep in mind. There's another question here that's really interesting. Okay, this is from Chris. Scientists are trained to be objective so that they can follow the data. They're supposed to be able to change their mind if the data come out differently than they think. But isn't that hard to do if you're advocating? Can you give an example of a time you changed your mind about something you were advocating because of new data? Excellent question. Naomi?
Yeah, I answered this question actually in the Q&A function. So if everybody wants to go and look at that answer, they can. But just to summarize it, as far as an example is concerned, the data on survivorship in bottlenose dolphins in captivity has been advancing over the years. And for me, I was always very careful with the language I use. I tried very hard as a scientist, because of my training, not to use hyperbole, not to use extremes of language in my adjectives and my adverbs, because that's often, not consistent with the data. It's also not a very scientific thing to do. You tend to be more measured. in your language when you're a scientist. And I bring that to my advocacy. And so that's helpful when the data change, when the science advances and you get new information. If you were measured to start with, you don't have to shift as much necessarily, and you can still make your point. So again, the survivorship of bottlenose dolphins has in fact been improving. That's just a fact. I mean, I can't ignore it. I don't necessarily think it changes, well, it doesn't change my position on whether they should be in captivity or not, because longevity or survivorship is just one metric. And the fact is you can be perfectly healthy and live a very long time and be utterly miserable. And, you know, you need to measure several metrics. You need to look at the whole picture, as it were, as best you can, to make your argument, to persuade, you know, others to your view. But you have to be careful not to abuse the data. And so I'm very clear to people when I'm talking to them that of the species that I'm aware of in captivity, bottlenose dolphins cope the best, but that doesn't mean they cope well. And it also doesn't mean that it's okay then for them to be in captivity, but not for orcas or belugas or whatever, because they're all cetaceans. They all have the same needs in terms of space and you know, keeping their brains engaged and so on, and they're not getting that in captivity. But the fact is, you know, I try very hard not to skip when the data change and you know, are not necessarily as clear cut as they used to be, or are shifting toward an argument that, oh, they live just as long in the wild as they do in captivity. Well, in fact, they do, bottlenose dolphins, but that's actually not a great argument in favor of it, because they don't have predators in captivity. They get 3 meals a day in captivity. They get veterinary care in captivity. They should be living way longer in captivity than they do in the wild, and they don't. So yes, they don't live in good facilities, quote unquote good facilities, don't live really short lives the way they do in really bad facilities. They live as long as they do in the wild, but they should be living longer. So it's still an argument, a data point, you know, a metric that I can use in favor of my position, but I try not to, you know, overstate things from the very beginning so that I don't have to, you know,
Thank you,
confuse people with new information, because that's what it is. It can be very confusing.
Thank you, Naomi. I just wanted to mention that, you know, there are different ways to come at this. And for myself, I'm driven by the data as well as everyone else here on the panel. And you have to really, as Naomi says, be really honest when the data don't shout from the rooftops what you would like to see to bolster your advocacy arguments. But if you don't do that, if you're not honest and you start to cherry pick and you start to, you know, massage the data, and it's over. It's over. You not only lose your credibility as a scientist, you could lose your credibility as an advocate. So you just don't go there, because it's a deal breaker.
Yeah, if I can, because I've been around longer than anybody else on the panel in terms of scholar advocacy. You will hurt your credibility, not just as a scientist, but as an advocate if you cherry pick. And one of the things that I found is, because I'm very careful about that, my credibility as a researcher and a scientist, well, I should say as a scientist, because I don't do field research anymore. My credibility as a scientist is still intact, and I work in different forums to do that. You know, the International Whaling Commission Scientific Committee. I work on trying to save a small population of dolphins in Taiwan. You know, I work in the wild, advocacy on wild animals. And so, you know, I have the respect of the wider scientific community still, because I've been very careful about that, even in my captive marine mammal, you know, welfare advocacy, which is a more hot topic, a more controversial topic that many of my scientific colleagues don't want to get involved in. And that's because I'm very careful about not cherry picking the data and trying to stay credible at all times.
One thing that just comes to mind, and it's something that it's real conversations I've had with students, because I've shared a lot of the work I did in college, whether it was for writing classes or for biology or other science classes. A lot of everything that I said about cetacean welfare or why they shouldn't, it all had to be backed up with sources. You know, everything has to have proof, you know, everything has to have data and evidence. And when I'm, you know, talking to a student that, you know, wants more information about, you know, basically being a scholar advocate, and I get a comment like, oh, well, you say, you know, SeaWorld isn't good for animals, but what about all the rescuing they do? You know, one piece of information doesn't necessarily cancel out another piece of information, you know, and that's why I try to explain to them. And also everything that was said about, you know, making sure you have good credibility when I teach them science writing and things like that. So I just thought it was a good example to bring up.
Thank you. Let's see if we can move on to another question. Let's see. Okay, here's one that's kind of interesting here. How is marine animal advocacy connected to climate change advocacy? And how can one advocate for both? Anyone?
If I may, yeah,
Amy?
if I can jump in on that. I think ultimately, and this is something that happens a lot for me, the forum where I have to grapple with this the most is the International Whaling Commission Scientific Committee. I work a lot on environmental protection issues within that forum. And it seems to me that in advocacy for the environment and for the wildlife that live in the environment, climate change is everything. It's the be all and end all at the moment. You know, it just has impacts that ramifies throughout everything. It's affecting the entire biosphere. It's affecting the entire biome. And if we do not get a handle, I mean, Greta Thunberg is not kidding. If we don't get a handle on climate change, you know, we're all we're not grappling with everything. We all have to pick our battles. We all have to focus on our individual specialties and our individual expertise. We can't be all things to all issues. We'll spread ourselves too thin as individuals. But ultimately, it all comes back to that. We are damaging the way the planet protects itself. And so if we don't get a grip on that societally, policy-wise, politically, all bets are off.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to go to a question that was submitted by email because I think it's a very, very interesting one. And I'd like to ask all of the panelists to weigh in on this one. This is from Olivia. And she asks, is there ever a point wherein you would need to prioritize research over advocacy, such as using studies on captive cetaceans to support research? Or in contrast, is there ever a point where you would have to forego taking part in research due to moral obligations if the captivity of cetaceans is a fundamental part of that research? Giles?
Well, briefly, and these are long stories that could take a long time to answer, but I turned down an opportunity to do a postdoc that I was very, very, very much wanting to do because it was going to be funded by SeaWorld. And I wasn't not going to be able to, even though I knew I could do good science, I could not be, and this was before Blackfish, I just didn't, I couldn't stomach the thought of that, taking money to do my postdoc, even though a large part of me thinks that SeaWorld should have been paying for decades for research, and they are now. And one of the research project, the Orca Scout project, has gotten funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which part of the money from that fund comes from SeaWorld. But for a direct connection, I was not going to personally be able to do that. On the other hand, as a killer whale biologist, I have reached out to somebody that I believe I think of as a colleague. He's somebody that's been very responsive, has very good answers. He's very educated and has a lot of experience with captive animals. And I have reached out to him, a gentleman, a vet at SeaWorld, to ask questions that I needed answers to for some issues that I was wondering about with regard to wild killer whales. And so I think that it's foolish to disregard the good science, some of the good science that has happened over the years.
Yeah.
And we need to find those common places where we can mine that information from folks that have had that experience. So those are my two kind of extremes. It's a conflict. I think that SeaWorld has been neglectful in paying through the years like they should have for wild killer whale research, and I'm happy that they're doing it. But I will say, you know, it's still a little bit of a hard pill to swallow. But I don't know if that made any sense, but that's my answer.
Thank you, Giles. Kara, did you want to say anything about that?
Sure. So since I don't do research, it's a different, I guess, perspective for me. But I think as what I feel like I could speak for a lot of people who aren't scientists or do research, or maybe just the general public, is, I guess, the purpose of the research, as long as the intentions are good. I think, you know, that to me is extremely important. So the intention is kind of what you're going to do with the research, if it's impactful in a positive way, and just, yeah, where you're going to use it, how it's, you know, going to benefit the animal, essentially, is most important for me.
Thank you. Mariah?
So this has happened to me personally as well. For my self-published book that I have, it is all pictures that I took of Lolita when I went to Miami Seaquarium when I happened to be in Florida with my family for vacation. And this was, you know, this was only a few years ago. So it was after, you know, I've already been involved in Superpod and all that kind of stuff. And I get questions, well, you're going in there to take pictures of her, you know, aren't you telling everyone to not go in there? That doesn't make any sense. But, you know, I got those pictures and I got lots of videos, not only of her, but of many other species of the dolphins. I got really great pictures of dolphins that have just holes in their mouth. They have absolutely no teeth. And that all that information went into not only my self-published book on Amazon, but also into a YouTube video that I made that got upwards of 5,000 views. So if my going into Miami Seaquarium, which, you know, my stand on that is obviously everyone knows I'm not going in there to watch her show. But if my going in there and my spending that money to spend that time with her and to collect essentially that data to then kind of analyze and put out to the public, well, that might have stopped, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 plus people of going in there, or those couple of thousands of people of telling their families or telling their friends, you know, what they think about this now. So it really is a give and take in most situations.
Mariah, what's the name of your book?
It is called Blackfish from Planet to Park. It's a play on SeaWorld's From Park to Planet.
Blackfish from Planet to Park. Thank you. Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, because I actually did work at a captive facility when I was an undergraduate. I volunteered at Koala Basin Marine Lab in Hawaii. And at that time, I didn't have an opinion about, you know, cetaceans in captivity. I you know, was in my early 20s, and I just, you know, I thought it was all great, you know, just back in those days, that was the conventional wisdom. And that facility was extremely small. It was actually completely inhumane, in my opinion, you know, with hindsight, but at the time I didn't have a problem with it. So, you know, once I realized what it was like for these animals out in the wild, which is how my transition occurred, I spent a lot of time in the field with these animals during my graduate career, and my whole viewpoint on them changed. I realized that, you know, I could no longer do that. I do not have a judgmental attitude toward those who work with captive marine mammals. I do not think that captive research is generally essential. There's a lot of it that's really just to improve husbandry for marine mammals, you know, to keep captivity moving forward. Some of it is important, some of it is valuable, and I do think there are ways where that can be done, where the animals spend minimal time in captivity and or, you know, are in better circumstances than a concrete tank at a public display facility where they have to slip the research in between shows. So, you know, I do not have an one size fits all opinion about captivity research, captive marine mammal research. I am nuanced in my opinion about it. But I do not judge the people who have based their entire careers on it. I'm not a judgmental person. That might make some people who are listening to this laugh, but I really am not, you know, and in the same way that I feel like I've maintained my scientific credibility in the scientific community, I'm certainly not going to be the one to ostracize people who continue to work with captive marine mammals. I've gotten too much of that directed at me for being anti-captivity. I'm not going to, you know, just turn around and, you know, reflect it back on people. That's just hypocritical of me. So, you know, I actually have, you know, I cite a lot of captive research in my advocacy, because in fact, some of that captive research has demonstrated that captivity does have negative impacts on these animals. So, you know, in terms of stress and whatnot, and how they behave differently under certain circumstances and so on. So I cite it, you know, and I respect those researchers for reporting their data honestly. So, you know, I personally would never work with captive animals again. I did when I was in my early 20s, but, you know, I recognize some value in captive research, and I certainly don't judge the folks who keep doing it.
Thank you. For myself, I'll just say that, you know, I did do research with captive dolphins and whales, beluga whales, for quite some time. And in fact, I actually really was on track to have a very successful research career in studying dolphin and whale intelligence and cognition in captivity. But in 2001, after I published my study with Diana Reese, showing that dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors, I actually made the decision to end that and to cut off my opportunity to do that. I was going to go on and study that in orcas in captivity and beluga whales in captivity and on and on and on. And, you know, I realized that by doing that, I was promoting, and at least I felt promoting captivity. And that felt not good. And I put that ahead of my own career interest. Of course, I've done a lot of other work, and mainly in the area of neuroscience, but sometimes you do have to give up things, and that's okay. You find other paths, so, you know, sometimes you can't do it all, and you have to just recognize what's important. And at the end of the day, whether you can look at yourself in the mirror or not, whether you're happy with what you've contributed and so forth. And that's a lot more important than one more line on your CV.
I'd just like to second what Lori just said. Everything you do in advocacy is to look yourself in the mirror.
Yep.
If you actually go into advocacy thinking you're going to change the world, you are going to be sorely disappointed. We are trying to change the world, no doubt about it, but any one individual is only going to make so much change happen in their lifetime. It's just a fact. Again, you can't ignore the data, you can't ignore the facts. You can, you know, you should do it because you're internally driven to do it because you want to sleep at night and look at yourself in the mirror. Don't go into it for ego. Don't go into it to change the world. Don't go into it to, you know, be a name. That is not going to be constructive motivation. It's just a little. Advice.
I'm going to turn to the last major question for the panelists because we are running out of time, unfortunately. This question is the following. What advice would you give students who want to study marine mammals, but also be an advocate for them? So we've been talking about scholar advocacy. We've been talking about being a scholar, a scientist, an educator, and also an advocate. And what this webinar is really about is about all of you who are attending and want to be or are young people in the field, young professionals, students who do want to blend science or scholarship and advocacy, and you're looking for a path forward. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to, unfortunately, briefly, to say just briefly, if you had to say something to up-and-coming students who want to be scholar advocates for marine mammals in marine mammal science, what would you say? So I'm going to start with Giles.
I would say to have scholarly advocacy back here in your brain for your goal of what you want to do. But specifically, if you're looking at wanting to go into the marine sciences, I personally would strongly encourage you to study conservation biology and the tenets of conservation biology, because ultimately, I really could go on for about 7 hours about conservation biology. But the upshot of it is that there's a mandate within that discipline of science that says that you have no choice as a scientist to advocate. They don't use that word. That's why I'm saying keep that notion back here in the back of your head. The other words are used, but get the science background that you're interested in getting, and then do it under the auspices of conservation biology. And if you do that, you're going to be by default being a scholarly advocate.
Thank you. Kara?
Yeah, I would just say perseverance is super important. You know, I've been mocked, I've been questioned and made fun of because I'm from Tennessee and now I live in Wisconsin, and people just, they don't understand why I want to advocate for marine mammals. And along those same lines, you know, just take any opportunity that you're able to. And if there aren't any opportunities, try to create them when possible, especially college age students. I went to a school in the Midwest, but I still founded a branch of the Citation Society. I had a, you know, captivity panel come, like Lori and Naomi came and spoke at this panel. And, you know, you just got to take those opportunities when they exist, but if not, you got to really create them for yourselves and network and just kind of put yourself out there. For younger kids, high school, middle school, start a club, do a presentation, just do anything that you can to kind of get yourself, you know, into the area that you're passionate about. You know, don't let people kind of tell you that it's not important.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, Mariah.
So first of all, second everything that Kara said, I completely agree. You definitely have to, you know, make your own path. I think that's definitely what I did. You know, the only reason I'm here in this webinar today is because when I was 18 and gave a speech on why you shouldn't boycott SeaWorld, you know, I tracked down people's emails and they seemed to like it. So, and that's why I'm here. You know, I do have a degree in biology, but, you know, I'm not a field scientist or anything like that yet. You can do scholar advocacy and marine mammal advocacy in any subject that there is. You can do it in writing, in art, in you know, technology. You know, I've made YouTube videos before. There's so many ways that you can really not only further your own education, but also further everyone else's. They say that the best way to learn is to teach. So just try and teach and tell other people what your viewpoint is, and you'll get better and better at it as time goes on.
Thank you, Mariah.
Yeah.
Naomi?
Yeah, I just second what everybody said. Cara in particular, I mean, make your own opportunities. You know, you have to make things happen sometimes for yourself. And sometimes, you know, I'm a firm believer that luck is not actually, you know, random or, you know, serendipitous. It's actually grasping opportunities when they whiz by you, because you're looking for them and you're waiting for them and you're ready to leap on them when they come by. A lot of people just, you know, when opportunity knocks, they don't recognize that that's who's at the door. And so always be looking for the opportunity to make stuff happen. Don't just hope it happens or sit around and wait for it to happen to you, you know. And then also, I second what Giles said, and I was just thinking, I was just replying to one of the questions about that on the Q&A. Get a really solid background in the science first, you know, whatever it is that you're interested in. When you're at that stage of your career, the whole point, if you want to become a scholar advocate, is you have to be a scholar first.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can be, and you can do advocacy things while you're becoming the scholar. You know, as, you know, Cara just said, you know, look for those opportunities, make those opportunities happen, start a club, do whatever, but get that background as well. And avoid trying to be a professional advocate, a professional scholar advocate, as in using your science for your advocacy before you actually have the science under your belt. Because you're likely to get things slightly wrong or not quite accurate, or you won't actually have the facts at hand. You might mess that up if you jump too early into scholar advocacy. So become the scholar first, become the professional scholar advocate second, do your sort of activism and your advocacy just out of your passion all along, you know, never stop doing that.
Right.
That's my advice.
I'd like to just second that, that the scholar advocacy is not about compromising the scholarship for the advocacy or vice versa. It is an approach, it's a stance. You know, you can be an advocate without being a scholar advocate. And you can be a scholar without feeling the need to advocate for anything or anyone. Scholar advocacy is different because it is really a scholarly, data-driven approach to advocacy. And what that means is no compromise on the rigor of your science, your scholarship, no compromise on the ethics of how you carry out your research, et cetera, et cetera. Know your stuff. The strongest position you can be in is to be someone who understands the science, creates the science, uses the science, articulates the science, but it's the science and the scholarship that is the scaffolding for your advocacy if you are a scholar advocate. So that's kind of the essence of what defines it. It's not the only way to do advocacy, but this is the way that all of us on this panel feel is a very powerful way to do advocacy. So I want to thank everyone. This hour went so quickly. And I want to thank everyone for their questions. We will try to get to them. If you still have questions, you know, we'll try to get to them after the webinar. We are sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But again, I want to thank Naomi, Giles, Mariah, Cara, for joining me and for being great scholar advocates in marine mammal science. So thanks everyone, and be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.